The winter of 1950 arrived like an executioner across the Korean peninsula, its wind cutting through uniforms and skin alike, stripping away any illusion that the war still had rules. Snow buried the hills and fields, but it could not bury fear. In a small village tucked between frozen rice paddies, civilians slept lightly, listening to the distant thunder of artillery and wondering if this night would be their last. The war had already taken their sons, their harvests, and their certainty. What it had not yet taken was their hope that staying quiet, staying invisible, might keep them alive. That hope shattered when boots crunched through snow just before dawn. Soldiers emerged from the darkness, rifles raised, breath steaming in the air. Orders were barked in harsh, clipped voices. Doors were kicked open, wooden frames splintering under the force. Families were dragged outside without explanation. An old man tried to ask what they had done wrong, his voice trembling more from cold than defiance, but the butt of a rifle knocked him to the ground before he finished the sentence. The accusation was simple and deadly: collaboration with the enemy. No evidence was offered, because none was required. Men were separated from women and children. Some wives clung desperately to their husbands, fingers numb but refusing to let go, until soldiers pried them apart. Children cried, their thin voices rising into the frozen air, only to be silenced by terrified mothers who knew noise could be fatal. The men were lined up near the edge of the village, facing a ditch that had been dug weeks earlier for irrigation. Now it served another purpose. A young farmer, barely 20, glanced back toward his home, toward the place where he had planned to raise a family, and understood in that moment that the future he imagined no longer existed. Gunfire erupted without ceremony. The sound echoed across the valley, sharp and final. Bodies collapsed into the ditch, some falling immediately, others twitching in the snow. A few were wounded but still alive, groaning softly until another shot ended the noise. The soldiers moved on quickly, as if afraid to linger among the dead. Behind them, the women stood frozen in place, unable to scream, unable to run, watching steam rise from the blood that darkened the snow. The war had reached into their village and taken what it wanted, leaving nothing but silence and disbelief. In another part of the peninsula, far from that village, a makeshift prisoner camp sprawled across a barren hillside. Barbed wire cut the landscape into harsh lines, and guard towers loomed like watchful eyes. Prisoners of war, young men who had once believed in causes and slogans, now believed only in survival. They slept packed together in drafty huts, sharing lice and sickness, counting the days by the slow depletion of their strength. Food was scarce, often no more than a thin soup and a handful of grain. Hunger became a constant companion, dulling thoughts and eroding dignity. Interrogations were a daily ritual. Prisoners were dragged out one by one, questioned under glaring lights or in freezing sheds. The goal was not information but submission. Beatings were common. Some were forced to stand for hours in the cold, others were deprived of sleep until reality blurred into hallucination. Confessions were extracted and discarded just as easily. A man might admit to anything if it meant the pain would stop, even briefly. Sometimes it didn't stop anyway. At night, whispers passed through the camp like ghosts. Names were spoken softly, followed by silence. Everyone knew what it meant when someone was called out after dark. The guards never explained where they took them. No bodies were returned. By morning, their sleeping space would be empty, their blanket folded away or taken by someone else. The absence became normal, another fact of camp life, as routine as hunger or fear. Learning not to ask questions was a survival skill. The guards themselves were not immune to what they were doing. Many were barely older than the prisoners they tormented, raised on propaganda that painted the enemy as less than human. Exhaustion and fear hardened them. Any sign of sympathy was dangerous, a weakness that could be punished. Violence became easier with repetition. Each act pushed the boundary of what felt possible, until acts that once would have been unthinkable became ordinary. Beyond the camps and villages, the war consumed entire regions. Civilians fled along frozen roads, carrying bundles of belongings tied with rope. Old women staggered under loads too heavy for their bodies. Children stumbled, their feet wrapped in rags instead of shoes. Refugee columns stretched for miles, desperate to reach safety, but safety was an illusion. Some were caught between advancing and retreating armies, trapped in open fields as shells exploded around them. Others were fired upon, suspected of hiding enemy soldiers among them. The distinction between civilian and combatant blurred until it vanished completely. The psychological terror was as devastating as the physical violence. People learned to fear silence as much as noise, because silence meant soldiers might be near. Trust dissolved. Neighbors watched each other closely, afraid that a careless word or gesture could lead to accusations. Communities that had survived centuries of hardship were torn apart in months. The war demanded loyalty and punished hesitation, even when the choices were impossible. As winter deepened, the cold preserved bodies where they fell, turning the landscape into a grim archive of violence. Frozen corpses lay beside roads, in fields, near burned-out homes. No one had time to bury them properly. The living walked past, eyes fixed ahead, carrying images they would never forget. Every step forward felt like betrayal of those left behind, but stopping meant death. By the end of that winter, the war had already crossed a line from which there was no return. It had taught soldiers to kill without questioning and civilians to endure the unbearable. It had reduced human lives to tactical problems and acceptable losses. Scene by scene, village by village, camp by camp, the Korean War revealed its most horrific truth, that in the machinery of total conflict, cruelty did not belong to one side alone, and innocence was the first casualty. As the war dragged into its third year, exhaustion settled over the land like a permanent fog, blurring the line between combat and atrocity until almost nothing remained clear. Front lines shifted back and forth across the same ruined hills, and with every movement came retaliation. Villages that had survived one army's passage were punished by the next. Homes were torched not because of proven collaboration, but because fear demanded an example. Smoke rose day after day, marking the slow erasure of entire communities from the map. Those who fled carried stories heavier than their bundles, stories they rarely spoke aloud because speaking made the memories feel too real. Refugees moved in endless lines along frozen roads and muddy tracks, watched from above by aircraft and from the sides by soldiers whose nerves were worn thin. Orders were confusing, often contradictory, and suspicion ruled every decision. A single rumor, that enemy fighters were hiding among civilians, could turn a column of desperate families into targets. Gunfire would rip through the crowd, scattering bodies and screams. Survivors ran without direction, abandoning the wounded because stopping meant dying too. Later, when the shooting stopped, the silence felt even crueler. Those left behind knelt beside the dead, unsure whether to mourn or flee before the violence returned. In occupied towns, control was enforced through terror. Curfews were imposed, and breaking them meant execution. Men were rounded up for questioning, sometimes never to be seen again. Women learned to lower their eyes, to make themselves small, knowing that power was absolute and accountability non-existent. Children grew up faster than they should have, learning the sounds of weapons before learning how to read. Their games mimicked the war around them, sticks becoming rifles, shouted commands replacing laughter. The prisoner camps grew more crowded as offensives captured and lost territory. Disease spread quickly through cramped conditions. Dysentery, frostbite, and untreated wounds killed quietly, without drama, claiming lives that never appeared in official counts. Guards struggled to maintain order among starving men, responding with harsher discipline. Collective punishment became routine. If one prisoner collapsed during forced labor, others were beaten to remind them all of the cost of weakness. Death lost its significance, becoming another administrative outcome. Interrogations intensified as frustration mounted. Prisoners were accused of crimes they did not understand, pressured to denounce comrades, forced to choose between loyalty and survival. Some broke under the strain, offering false confessions that satisfied no one and solved nothing. Others resisted in silence, enduring pain that reshaped their understanding of endurance itself. When bodies were finally released at the war's end, families would barely recognize the men who returned, if they returned at all. Behind the front lines, retaliation fed on retaliation. Mass graves multiplied, hastily dug and poorly marked, if marked at all. Years later, farmers would uncover bones while plowing fields, fragments of lives interrupted and never acknowledged. Each discovery reopened wounds that had never truly healed. The land itself seemed to remember, refusing to forget what had been done upon it. As negotiations dragged on in distant rooms, the fighting continued on the ground with bitter intensity. Soldiers knew talks were happening, yet they were still ordered to advance, to hold positions at any cost. Lives were spent for hills that would later be abandoned by agreement. This knowledge poisoned morale. Some obeyed numbly, others with rage, taking it out on anyone unlucky enough to fall into their power. War crimes were not always driven by ideology, often they were born from despair, anger, and the need to feel control in a situation defined by chaos. When the armistice finally came, it arrived not as relief but as a strange quiet that many did not trust. Guns fell silent, yet fear remained. Families emerged cautiously from hiding, searching for relatives who would never return. Villages tried to rebuild, using burned timbers and salvaged stones, but reconstruction could not restore what had been lost. Survivors carried invisible injuries, nightmares, sudden panic at loud noises, a constant readiness for violence that no longer had a clear target. The division of the peninsula froze the war's outcome without resolving its trauma. Borders hardened, stories fractured, and blame settled into official narratives that left little room for shared suffering. Many atrocities went uninvestigated, buried beneath political necessity and the desire to move on. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and silence became another casualty of the conflict. Yet the war crimes of the Korean War did not disappear with time. They lived on in the behavior of generations shaped by fear and mistrust, in families who avoided certain topics, in landscapes that still hid their dead. The survivors understood something history books often softened, that the greatest horror was not only the violence itself, but how easily it became normal. The war taught ordinary people how quickly humanity could be stripped away, and how difficult it was to reclaim it once the guns stopped firing.